Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get through this. As most of you know, uh, I've been out of pocket. I've been unable to speak now for almost 2 weeks. In fact, today will be 4 weeks or 2 weeks. I came down with another severe respiratory infection, settled in my throat. It's been borderline pneumonia. Thankfully, it hasn't gone over into that. But, I still feel about half a bubble off center. Now, I feel worlds better than I did for the majority of the time. It's just that I'm still having a great deal of difficulty talking time, anytime at all. And I start going into pretty severe coughing spasms. I have to use my little albuterol inhaler in order to get things kind of opened up and what have you. But I had set today as my target day to begin filming again. And so this is our continuation of our review of the book, The Future of Rome. And I have suggested to you, and the reason I chose this book is because it was recommended to me by Derek Lambert, a former believer, now an atheist. And he had originally promised that he and I would have a conversation, not a debate, but a conversation on his internet blog. And that didn't transpire. And when I started pressing him on it a little bit, he just said, well, I'm going to recommend that you get this book on the future of Rome. He said it will answer every single thing that you will say. And he said it just he said it positively destroys the idea of the early dating of Revelation and its application to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, I was eager to get the book. I was eager to see what this devastating information might be. And as I have already made mention, the great majority of the book, first 10 chapters, honestly have nothing whatsoever to do with establishing that the book of Revelation was written late under Domitian, or that the book of Revelation has anything to do with the destruction of Rome, or even our future in some sense. There's just nothing there. However, in chapter 11, written by Peter Oakes, he sets out some, quote, evidence, unquote, supposedly demonstrating that the book really is about Rome and really does need a late date application. Well, I've got to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I've already said this. Let me say this again. Mr. Oakes is guilty of some of the very worst exegesis imaginable. It's not truly exegesis. The things that he overlooks, the things that he literally ignores in setting forth his case are some of the most fundamental aspects of this study, and yet he doesn't even mention them. And today's topic is another prime example of that and what I mean. But the last time I was with you, 2 weeks ago now, I examined how the book of Revelation, and Mr. Oakes points out that the book of Revelation is about the city guilty of shedding all of the blood. Well, Mr. Oakes just takes it for granted that's got to be Rome. He completely completely and totally ignores the testimony of the Tanakh and how the prophets identified Old Covenant Jerusalem as the city, as the bloody city to whom the prophets were sent over and over and over again. He completely overlooks the parabolic teaching of Jesus, the epistolary testimony of Paul, even of James, in which the guilt for killing the prophets and Jesus' apostles and prophets is laid right at the feet of Israel, O covenant Jerusalem. Not a word about it. It's as if none of that evidence existed. So we come to a subject today in which he does exactly the same thing. Now, this is on page 207 of chapter 11, and again by Peter Oakes. I'm going to read I'll read the entire paragraph. John then hears a great crowd in heaven calling out praise to God for the judgment of the harlot and the avenging of the blood of God's servants. I've already covered the harlot and the shedding of the blood. A second call praises God as, quote, her smoke ascent goes up forever and ever, unquote, 19:3. Further rejoicing in heaven culminates in announcement of the wedding of the Lamb to a woman clothed in bright, pure linen, chapter 19, verse 8. John is told by the angel of 17:1 to write that those invited to the wedding feast are blessed and that the words are genuine words of God, chapter 19, verse 9. At the end of the vision, John falls down to worship the angel. He is rebuked and directed to worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, chapter 19 and verse 10. Well, I want you to notice once again that Mr. Oakes just absolutely sets out the thesis. It's not really a thesis. Just sets out the assumption that the wedding takes place at the destruction of Rome. Now, I want you to ask yourself an initial question. What in the world would the destruction of Rome have to do with the marriage of the body of Christ? Because you see, Revelation not only contains for us and depicts for us the impending wedding, but it also depicts the impending divorce. Now, I've got to tell you, I'm looking forward very, very eagerly to Kenneth Gentry's massive 2-volume work on the divorce of Israel in the book of Revelation. I've already read enough of his material outside of these two books, and it's at the printer. It should be available very soon. I've already got I think I've got my pre-order in. If I don't, I will have very shortly. Anyway, but Kenneth Gentry has, in other venues, and certainly in this upcoming 2-volume set forth the premise, and he's not alone, by the way. David Chilton did the same thing. I've done the same thing in my book, Who Is This Babylon? So the point of fact is, scholars have noted that the book of Revelation is about the divorcement of Old Covenant Jerusalem and Judah, and the remarriage of all 12 tribes reconstituted, reformulated, recreated as the new covenant bride. So again, this is not a preterist view, okay? This is not a distinctive preterist view. This is something that scholars have recognized for a long, long time. Well, Mr. Oakes ignores this. And he never addresses the question, what relationship would the destruction of Rome have to do with the marriage of Israel? Or we can reformulate it. What would the destruction of Rome have to do with the marriage of the church? And if Babylon is Rome, at what point of time was Rome ever married to the Lord, insomuch that the book of Revelation depicts her divorcement? Folks, there's nothing there. It is absolutely outside the bounds of proper exegesis and hermeneutic to say, well, yeah, Revelation, it's about the impending judgment of Rome, which, by the way, was still 400 years away from John, which is a violation of the language of these things must shortly come to pass. All that aside, okay, when you ignore the fact that Revelation is about the divorcement of Babylon, the harlot city, and when you ignore the fact that it's the wedding of Israel, then your exegesis is doomed. It's lost. It is fundamentally wrong. You see, unless we fail to understand how Hebraic the book of Revelation really is, and by the way, Mr. Oakes really doesn't focus on that aspect of the book of Revelation either. Once again, he jumps to this conclusion, John is writing the Revelation, and it's about the destruction of Rome, so why should I be focused on interpreting the book from a Hebraic perspective? It's all about Rome. It's not about Hebraic promises. Fundamentally flawed. And how do I know this? I know this because the book of Revelation, according to some scholars, cites, quotes, echoes, alludes to over 400 Old Testament passages. Okay, so you got a book here, and let's just cut that number in half, just purely arbitrarily and capriciously. Let's just cut that number in half. Let's just say there are 200 Old Testament references in the book of Revelation. References in the prophetic books, which talk about the last days, and which talk about Israel's last days. And that includes the book of Deuteronomy and the Song of Moses, which 3 times tells us it's about Israel's last days. So, upon what basis do we come to a book like Revelation that cites, quote, 200 Old Testament passages, once again to reiterate, which are promises made to Old Covenant Israel about Israel's last days, and completely, absolutely, 100% ignore those fundamental facts and just assume that it's a book about what? About a pagan city. Now, was God concerned with the destruction of pagan cities in the Old Testament at times? Yes, no question about it, and I'm not denying that. What I am saying is that the book of Revelation is quoting from, alluding to Old Testament prophecies that concerned Israel and her fate, her destiny in her last days. Not in the days of Rome, not in the last days of time, but in the last days of Israel. Folks, these are such critical, fundamental, hermeneutical issues that it's literally staggering when you have a scholar of such repute as Peter Oakes, who doesn't even give these facts a passing notice. Certainly no in-depth consideration of that. So consider the following. In Hosea chapter 2, addressing the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and of course they had gone off, they had departed from Judah, and so you had 2 houses of Israel, northern house, southern house of Israel. And the 10 northern tribes went off into apostasy, idolatry, in an unprecedented manner. She committed spiritual adultery. Well, what did the law of Moses say about adultery? Put the wife away. Put her away. And so, as Sebastian Smolars points out in The Metaphor of Marriage, in his marvelous book, you ought to get it, it's kind of expensive, but nonetheless. But as Smolars points out, the word for harlot that is used over and over and over, 91 times in the Old Testament, is used predominantly to speak of a wife that had broken the marriage covenant by committing adultery. Well, here is Hosea, Yahweh through Hosea, presenting the 10 northern tribes as Yahweh's wife who has committed adultery. So he says, write her a bill of divorcement. She is not my wife. I am not her husband. Now, in a book somewhat contemporary, Isaiah chapter 54, your maker, Yahweh, is your husband, says the Lord. But he was going to put her away. Jeremiah chapter 3, addressing the harlotry, the adultery of the two southern tribes, nonetheless said that when Jeremiah witnessed the adultery of her older sister and how she was put away, she did not learn, but she went and became worse and worse. So what do we have? We have the recognition, the Old Testament recognition, that Yahweh was married to the 10 northern tribes. Well, the fact is, as Jeremiah chapter 3 points out, as I just noted, the two southern tribes became worse. But you see, God could not divorce them, and he could not destroy them at that time. Well, why? Well, because the Messiah was supposed to come through the tribe of Judah. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 14. It is evident that our Lord sprang from Judah. Okay? So he could not divorce and destroy Judah at the time that he destroyed Israel. But in Hosea chapter 6, speaking of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and their harvest of destruction that was about to come, he said, and Judah will have her harvest as well in the day in which the Lord would save the remnant. So the 10 northern tribes were accused of adultery and they were destroyed. They were divorced. God could not destroy the two southern tribes, even though they committed adultery, because Messiah had not yet come. And yet God said the time was coming in which Judah would have the same kind of harvest that the 10 northern tribes had received. Once again, what was the harvest of the 10 northern tribes? Divorce and destruction. Judah would have her harvest of divorce and destruction. So what happens when we come to the New Testament period? And Jesus has come. He's been incarnated. What do we find? No less than 3 times. That's significant. But no less than 3 times, Jesus called Judah and Jerusalem of his generation a wicked and adulterous generation. Why do you suppose Jesus used that terminology? Well, he used that terminology because it was the terminology of Hosea and Jeremiah even. So what Jesus was saying, as John the Baptizer said, the time of the harvest was coming imminently. Matthew chapter 3, John said, the winnowing fork, that's imagery of harvest, was already in the hands of Jesus. Matthew 13, Jesus said, harvest is at the end of the age. What age? The end of the age when the power of the holy people will be completely shattered, according to Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. And Jesus quotes from Daniel 12 in Matthew 13. The harvest would be at the end of the age. And Revelation chapter 14 says the time of the harvest had come, the hour of his judgment. The hour of his judgment is the harvest of the land. And it's the time in which the great city Babylon, which is where the Lord was crucified, would be slain. Not only that, in chapter 18, verse 4, this great city Babylon cries out and laments, I am no widow. You know, I stated on one of my YouTube videos some while back, I wasn't exactly sure how to understand that terminology of I am no widow. And yet one of my very helpful viewers pointed out, Isaiah chapter 54, that when God destroyed the 10 northern tribes, he described her even though she's the one that died, as a widow. And not only that issue is involved, but it's the fact that under ancient Hebraic thought, a woman without a husband, whether he died or not, a woman who had been divorced was considered a widow. Here's Babylon, the city where the Lord was crucified, getting ready to be destroyed, getting ready to be divorced, saying, I am no widow. I'm married. I'm married. Well, who could say that? O covenant Judah. So when we come to Revelation 19, and we have the destruction of this city Babylon, once again, which is where the Lord was crucified, we have the song of victory. Now, mind you, this is critical. Chapter 19 quotes from Deuteronomy 32:43, as well as Psalm 78, to say that in the destruction of Babylon, he has avenged the blood of his saints. Well, once again, folks, that's a direct quote from Deuteronomy 32:43, which is about Israel's last days, her last fate. So the destruction of Babylon in Revelation, in vindication of the martyrs, would be the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 32:43, but Deuteronomy 32:43 would be the time of Israel's final fate, her last end. And in chapter 19, the song is quoted as fulfilled in the destruction of Babylon. Not only that, at that destruction, what happened? Revelation 19:6 and following. Rejoice and be glad, because the time of the wedding has come, the wedding of the Lamb. And the saints have made themselves ready. They've adorned themselves in white robe, which is the righteousness of the saints. Now, very quickly, very quickly, God divorced the 10 northern tribes. But in Hosea chapter 2, 21 and 23, God said that in the last days, I will betroth you to me again. I will betroth you to me in righteousness. But you see, he destroyed the kingdom. But he would restore her under Messiah, recreated as a new Israel. And the same with Judah and Benjamin. He would destroy the old covenant form, and he would take all 12 tribes, join them together with the Gentiles, and create one new man. And God would remarry that one new creation. 12 northern tribes. And so what do we find in the book of Revelation? At the destruction of the old covenant city, Babylon, where the Lord was crucified, we have the wedding. And John said, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, because the first had fled away. There was no place found for them. And I saw New Jerusalem. Now, folks, why would John use the terminology? Why would Jesus use the terminology of a New Jerusalem in contrast to Rome? Rome was not Jerusalem. It was not the old Jerusalem. But John saw a new Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven as a bride adorned for her husband. Now, my question again is, where do you get Rome in any of that discussion? You have to divorce, pun intended, the subject of the wedding and the marriage completely from its Old Testament roots and from its New Testament roots. And you have to say that the book of Revelation has nothing whatsoever to do with God's divorcement of Israel or Judah, that it has nothing whatsoever to do with the wedding of Matthew chapter 22. You have to say that no other subject, no other discussion of the marriage and remarriage of Yahweh is relevant to understanding the book of Revelation, even though the book of Revelation draws on those Old Testament prophets. I'm sorry, folks. As the old saying goes, this doesn't even make good nonsense. It is not proper exegesis. It is an abuse of hermeneutic. It defies logic and abuses logic. I'm out of time. I'm out of voice. Thank you for joining me. I don't know if I'll be able to join Mike tonight or not. This has been really tough on my voice. But I hope to see you there. No promises, but I hope to see you there. God bless and thanks for joining me.